The sound of her phone's notification shattered the silence in the kitchen, a sharp, unwelcome intrusion into the ordinary rhythm of my evening. My hand hovered over the kettle, the steam curling lazily upward as I froze in place. My eyes drifted toward the glowing screen lying innocently on the counter. I shouldn't have looked, at least. That's what I told myself later. But something inside me, a quiet gnawing voice, urged me to glance over. The preview message glowed like a spotlight in the dim room, exposing something I couldn't yet grasp. The words were innocuous on the surface, but held an edge that cut through the air. I can't wait to see you again. My stomach tightened, as if an invisible hand had clenched it. The words pulsed in my mind, throbbing with questions that spiraled out of control. I turned back to the kettle, gripping the handle as though it could anchor me to reality. The water bubbled and hissed, the sound doing little to drown out the storm brewing inside my head. My rational side tried to brush it off. Maybe it was nothing, perhaps a joke, a casual exchange blown out of proportion by the eerie quiet of the house. But the unease clawed its way deeper into me, its grip relentless. She walked into the room a few minutes later, her steps light and effortless as always. Her laughter echoed softly as she spoke to someone on the phone, her voice warm, familiar, disarming. I couldn't pinpoint why, but everything about her in that moment felt surreal, as though I was observing her through a distorted lens. My chest felt heavy, my breath shallow. I turned away, avoiding her gaze. The evening unfolded in its usual rhythm, dinner shared at the small table in the corner, the faint hum of the television filling the background. She spoke about her day, about mundane things that once held my attention, but now felt like static. I nodded, responding when appropriate, though I barely registered her words. My mind kept circling back to the message. When she left the room to take a shower, I sat there paralyzed. My rational side battled fiercely against the growing shadow of suspicion. It was one message, a single line. It didn't mean anything. It couldn't mean anything. But the part of me that couldn't ignore the tightness in her smile or the flicker in her eyes told me otherwise. Her phone sat abandoned on the counter again, the screen dark, its secrets locked away behind a passcode I didn't know. I stood, pacing the room, the internal debate raging louder with each step. The need to know gnawed at me, eroding any sense of propriety or restraint. I approached the phone, my heart pounding, my hand hesitating just inches above it. The moment passed. I couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to break that unspoken trust, even as the weight of doubt bore down on me. I stepped back, retreating to the couch and gripping the armrest until my knuckles turned white. The shower turned off, her voice calling out cheerfully moments later, and I forced myself to respond in kind. The night dragged on, my unease deepening with every minute. Later, lying in bed beside her, the room bathed in the soft glow of the bedside lamp, I watched her scroll through her phone. Her expression was unreadable, her focus fixed on the screen. I wanted to ask her, to break the silence and demand answers, but the words stuck in my throat. If I said something, I'd cross a line. If I didn't, I'd drown in the storm raging within me. She glanced over at me and smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners in that way that once melted my heart. But tonight the gesture felt practiced, calculated. She reached over, her hand brushing against mine, and I forced myself to hold on to her touch, to anchor myself in the moment. The weight of the message loomed large between us, unspoken but undeniable. The night stretched endlessly as I lay staring at the ceiling. Her breathing slowed, signaling she had fallen asleep. My own rest felt impossible. I turned over, my eyes landing on her phone resting on the nightstand. The screen was dark now, but it felt like it was glowing in my mind's eye. The questions gnawed at me like a constant whisper, pushing me toward action. As quietly as I could, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her. My footsteps were soundless on the carpet as I made my way to the kitchen, seeking the solitude I desperately needed. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, a grounding presence amid the chaos in my head. I leaned against the counter, gripping its edge until my knuckles turned white. My mind was a battlefield of warring emotions. Trust against suspicion, love against fear. Memories of our life together flickered through my mind, snapshots of laughter, whispered promises, and shared dreams. They felt distant now, like echoes of a life that no longer belonged to me. The urge to return to her phone burned within me. This time, it wasn't about suspicion, it was about survival. I needed clarity, an answer to the gnawing questions. The need to know outweighed the fear of what I might find. My feet moved before my mind caught up, carrying me back to the bedroom. Her phone lay within reach, a simple device that now felt like a Pandora's box. My fingers hovered over it, trembling as they approached the screen. The passcode was a barrier, one I didn't have the key to, but even holding the device felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. I set it back down and retreated once again, the conflict unresolved but no less fierce. This war within me wasn't just about her. It was about us, about everything we had built and everything I feared we might lose. As I sat alone in the darkness, the weight of the unspoken message bore down on me, threatening to crush the man I thought I was. The next morning, I found myself staring into my coffee, watching the swirling steam rise in lazy spirals. The message from the night before hung in my mind like a shadow, coloring every word, every movement. She sat across from me, humming softly as she scrolled through her phone, her expression unreadable. Her hair fell loosely over her shoulders, and she looked as calm and radiant as ever. Yet, I felt a chasm growing between us, a silent void that neither of us acknowledged. The logical part of me screamed for patience, for reason. People send messages like that all the time, I told myself. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, a misread, or even a joke. But the nagging doubt refused to loosen its grip. Every laugh, every fleeting glance she offered me felt weighted with a secret I couldn't see but could feel. She placed her phone down and smiled, the same smile that once felt like a ray of sunlight. This morning, it barely warmed me. Her voice broke the silence, her words light and conversational, filled with updates about her day ahead. I nodded, responding when appropriate, the motions automatic, the connection between us feeling like a fragile thread stretched thin. The denial crept in slowly, wrapping itself around me like a comforting lie. I told myself I was overthinking, that the stress of work and life had sharpened my insecurities. After all, she had never given me a reason to doubt her before. This one message, taken out of context, couldn't erase years of trust. Could it? I decided not to bring it up. Not yet. Maybe the doubt would fade on its own, and life could resume its steady, predictable rhythm. But as the hours passed, I realized that every smile she gave, every word she spoke, felt carefully measured. Her casual gestures now seemed practiced, calculated. The lightness I once admired in her movements carried an undertone of restraint, as though she were keeping something at bay. By the afternoon, I felt like I was watching our life unfold through a glass pane, separated from the intimacy we once shared. I replayed the moment in the kitchen over and over, dissecting her actions for signs I might have missed. Her laughter echoed in my mind, sharp and clear, but devoid of the warmth I used to feel when I heard it. As the day wore on, I found myself questioning my own judgment. Was it fair to suspect her based on a single text? People joke, they share moments that mean nothing, and I had no context for the message. She had always been transparent, never one to hide things. Maybe the problem was me, my inability to let go of a fleeting doubt. That evening, as we sat together on the couch, I tried to will myself into believing that nothing had changed. The television flickered in front of us, but I couldn't focus on the images or the dialogue. She rested her head on my shoulder, a familiar and comforting gesture, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that everything was fine. But even in that moment of closeness, the shadow lingered. Her head felt light against my shoulder, as though she were there, but not truly present. I resisted the urge to ask her, to confront the doubt head-on. The risk of shattering the fragile peace between us held me back. As we got ready for bed, she moved around the room with her usual grace, her routine as steady and predictable as ever. I watched her, searching for cracks in the facade, for anything that might reveal the truth. But she gave me nothing. Her smile as she slipped under the covers was soft and familiar, her good night kiss tender and brief. Still, it felt like there was an invisible wall between us, a barrier she either didn't notice or pretended wasn't there. Lying in the dark, I stared at the ceiling, the weight of denial pressing down on me. I told myself again that it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but the doubts refused to be silenced. Every breath she took beside me felt like a question I couldn't answer, a riddle I couldn't solve. As sleep eluded me once more, I realized that denial wasn't enough. The truth, whatever it was, would have to come to light. But I wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. For now, I clung to the hope that I was wrong, that the shadow over us was a figment of my imagination. Yet, deep down, I knew it wouldn't stay buried for long. The tension that had been building inside me reached its breaking point the following evening. I had spent the day trying to focus on work, distracting myself with tasks and emails that seemed trivial compared to the storm in my mind. But no amount of meetings or small talk could drown out the doubt. It grew louder, demanding to be acknowledged. When I came home, she greeted me at the door with her usual brightness. Her smile was soft, her voice warm, but I could feel the weight behind her eyes. It wasn't sadness, it was something else, something heavier. She asked about my day, and I gave her the same tired answers as always. I tried to return her smile, but it felt forced, strained. As the evening wore on, the silence between us grew louder. She busied herself in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. I sat at the table, watching her move with practiced ease, my mind spiraling into darker places. The message haunted me like a ghost, its words etched into my memory. After dinner, I couldn't hold it in any longer. My heart pounded in my chest as I set down my fork and looked at her. The words tumbled out before I could stop them. Who was the message from last night? My voice sounded foreign, low and tense, even to my own ears. She froze for a moment, her hands stilling over her glass of wine. It was so brief that anyone else might have missed it, but I caught it. Her face shifted, the smile faltering before she quickly recovered. She looked at me with a mixture of confusion and something I couldn't quite place. What message? The room felt smaller, the air thicker. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my hands gripping the edge of the table as I tried to steady myself. The notification on your phone. I saw it when I was in the kitchen. It said, "I can't wait to see you again." Who sent it? Her reaction was immediate, but not what I expected. She laughed, a short, sharp sound that carried no humor. Her hand waved dismissively as she shook her head. That? Oh, that was nothing. Just a coworker joking around. You know how people are? Her explanation felt rehearsed, too quick, too polished. I wanted to believe her, to let the tension between us dissolve into the air. But something in her tone, in the way she avoided my eyes, set my nerves on edge. It wasn't like her. She was always straightforward, direct, even blunt. This response was out of character, and it only fueled my doubts. I pressed further, my voice tightening. Why would a coworker send something like that? It doesn't sound like a joke. Her eyes darted to the side for a split second, and I saw it. The flicker of discomfort, the hesitation she tried to mask. She took a long sip of her wine, her fingers tapping lightly against the glass. It's just office banter. You're reading too much into it. There's nothing to worry about. Her words were meant to reassure me, but they did the opposite. The casual tone, the dismissive shrug, it all felt like a carefully constructed shield, one that was starting to crack. I stared at her, searching her face for the truth, but she had already turned her attention back to her plate, as if the conversation was over. For a moment, I sat there, unsure of what to do next. The rational part of me told me to drop it, to let it go and move on. But the other part, the part that couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut, wouldn't let me. I stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and walked to the living room. She called out after me, asking if I was okay, but I didn't respond. I needed space, needed time to process what had just happened. I sank into the couch, the weight of the confrontation settling over me like a heavy blanket. The house was quiet, save for the faint sounds of her cleaning up in the kitchen. I closed my eyes, replaying the conversation over and over in my mind. Her laughter, her words, her body language, they all pointed to one thing. She was hiding something. The question was what? When she joined me on the couch later, she acted as if nothing had happened. She curled up beside me, her head resting on my shoulder, her fingers tracing absent-mindedly over my arm. I tried to relax, to convince myself that I was overreacting, but the knot in my stomach refused to loosen. That night, as we lay in bed, the silence between us was deafening. I stared at the ceiling, the darkness pressing down on me, while her breathing slowed and deepened. Sleep would not come for me. All I could think about was the message, her response, and the growing chasm between us. The confrontation had done nothing to ease my doubts. If anything, it had only deepened them. I told myself I needed more proof, more clarity, before I could take another step. But deep down, I knew the truth was already there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to face it. The turning point came 2 days later. I was home earlier than usual, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She had texted earlier to say she'd be working late, a detail that struck me as strange given the lack of urgency in her tone. She often worked late, but this time the message felt different, vague, disconnected. Her phone sat on the counter where she had left it that morning. I had stared at it countless times since the night of the confrontation, its dark screen mocking me, holding secrets I couldn't ignore any longer. Tonight, though, I decided I couldn't let it mock me any longer. The doubt had festered long enough, eroding every sense of trust one had once clung to. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I unlocked the screen using her passcode. She had shared it with me years ago, a gesture of openness and trust that now felt like a cruel irony. The home screen blinked to life, a sea of apps and notifications that felt alien despite their familiarity. My thumb hovered over the messaging app, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. The messages opened in an instant. At first, it was the usual stream of chats, friends, family, coworkers, mundane and ordinary. But I kept scrolling, my eyes scanning for the name that didn't belong. Then I found it, Mark. My pulse quickened as I tapped on the name, the thread unfolding like a slow unraveling of everything I had feared. The texts were casual at first, peppered with jokes and emojis that seemed harmless. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. His words became flirtatious, her responses coy. Each message felt like a dagger, slicing away at the thin veil of hope I had tried to maintain. Looking forward to seeing you tonight. You looked incredible yesterday. I've been thinking about you all day. Her replies were just as damning. You make me smile more than I should. Can't wait for our next escape. Your trouble, you know that? The words blurred before my eyes, the ache in my chest tightening with each passing second. The truth was there in black and white, undeniable and inescapable. My hands shook as I scrolled back, needing to understand how long this had been going on. Weeks, months. The timeline stretched back further than I had imagined, their exchanges weaving a narrative I hadn't been a part of. I stumbled across a photo, a selfie she had sent him. She was smiling, her hair tousled in a way that looked natural but deliberate. The caption beneath it read, "Missing you already." It was a face I knew well, but in that moment, it felt like I was looking at a stranger. The air in the room seemed to thin, each breath more difficult than the last. I set the phone down on the counter, unable to bear holding it any longer. My mind raced, trying to piece together what this meant, what I would do next. The anger boiled beneath the surface, hot and volatile, but it was tempered by an overwhelming sadness. This wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was a shattering of everything we had built together. I left the kitchen, needing space to think, to breathe. I walked out onto the back porch, the cool evening air hitting me like a slap. The world outside seemed calm, indifferent to the turmoil raging inside me. The stars blinked in the sky, distant and unbothered, as if mocking the insignificance of my pain. For a while, I just stood there, staring into the darkness, my mind swirling with questions. How had I missed this? When had we drifted so far apart that she sought solace in someone else? The answers didn't come, only the raw ache of betrayal filling the void. I heard the front door open an hour later, her footsteps light and deliberate as she moved through the house. She called out, her voice cheerful, and I responded with a calmness that surprised even me. She found me on the porch, her face lighting up when she saw me. She kissed my cheek, her touch warm but hollow. The distance between us had never felt so vast. "How was your day?" she asked, her tone light and casual. "Fine," I replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. She didn't notice, or perhaps she didn't care. She moved inside to put her things down, leaving me alone once again with the knowledge that had forever changed the course of our lives. The evidence was clear now, undeniable, and etched into my mind. I couldn't ignore it any longer. But as I stood there, the weight of what I had uncovered pressing down on me, I realized I still didn't know what I would do. The truth was out, but the path forward remained uncertain, shrouded in the same shadow that had haunted me since that first message. The days that followed were a blur of emotions I could barely control. Anger would surge through me, hot and wild, only to be replaced by a cold emptiness that left me hollow. I couldn't look at her the same way, couldn't hear her voice without feeling the sting of betrayal behind every word. The texts I had read replayed in my mind endlessly, her laughter with him now louder than anything we'd shared. I kept telling myself I needed more time to process, more time to decide. But time offered no relief. It only deepened the ache, as if the weight of the truth grew heavier the longer I carried it. I avoided her as much as I could, filling my days with work and mundane tasks that allowed me to retreat into myself. When she asked if something was wrong, I brushed it off, offering excuses that neither of us believed. She didn't press. Maybe she already knew. Maybe she could feel the shift between us, the subtle yet undeniable fracture that divided our world in two. Yet she carried on as if nothing had changed, her routines unbroken, her smiles undiminished. It was almost cruel how normal she seemed, how easily she pretended that everything was fine. At night, the silence in our bedroom became unbearable. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, while she drifted off beside me, her breathing steady and calm. Sleep eluded me, my mind consumed by the knowledge of her betrayal and the memories of the life we'd built together. I thought of our wedding day, the vows we'd exchanged, the promises we'd made. Each memory felt like a blade twisting in my chest. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. What could I say that wouldn't shatter the fragile facade we were clinging to? How could I look her in the eye and tell her I knew when even thinking about it left me reeling? The fear of what her response might be, her denial, her excuses, or worse, her indifference, kept me paralyzed. One evening, I came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. The sight of her with that device, her lifeline to him, ignited a fury I could barely contain. I wanted to grab it, to throw it against the wall, to destroy the connection that had come between us. But I didn't. I simply walked past her, mumbling a greeting before retreating to the sanctuary of the bedroom. There, I sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The walls seemed to close in, the air too thick to breathe. I felt like a stranger in my own home, a ghost haunting the remnants of a life that no longer felt like mine. I couldn't escape the thoughts that consumed me. Every time she laughed, I wondered if she was thinking of him. Every time she looked at me, I questioned whether she was comparing me to him. The doubts gnawed at me relentlessly, eroding what little confidence I had left. The worst part was the uncertainty. The texts had told me what I needed to know, but they hadn't given me the answers I craved. Was she in love with him? Was this just a fleeting affair? Or had she already made plans to leave? The not knowing was a torture all its own, a slow, insidious poison that seeped into every corner of my mind. I started to retreat further, distancing myself not just from her, but from everything. Friends' calls went unanswered, their invitations ignored. Work became a monotonous blur, each task performed on autopilot. The things that had once brought me joy, reading, music, even the simple pleasure of a quiet evening, now felt empty and meaningless. She noticed the change, of course. How could she not? She asked if I was stressed, if something at work was bothering me, if I wanted to talk. Her concern only fueled my resentment. How could she act so caring, so loving, when she was the one who had destroyed us? Her kindness felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of the woman she used to be. One night, she reached for my hand as we lay in bed, her fingers intertwining with mine. It was a gesture of intimacy, of connection, but it felt like a lie. I pulled away, muttering something about being tired, and turned my back to her. The hurt in her voice when she said good night was palpable, but I didn't care. I couldn't. I was spiraling, and I knew it. The anger and sadness were consuming me, pulling me into a darkness I couldn't escape. I didn't know how to stop it, how to pull myself back from the edge. All I knew was that I couldn't go on like this. Something had to give. But every time I thought about confronting her, about demanding the truth, the fear held me back. Fear of her answers. Fear of what they would mean for us. Fear of facing the reality I had been trying so desperately to avoid. So I stayed silent, letting the spiral pull me further under, waiting for a moment of clarity that might never come. It happened on a Saturday morning. The house was quiet, the sunlight streaming through the blinds in soft, golden slats. She was in the kitchen, humming as she prepared breakfast, the sound carrying an unsettling normalcy. I sat in the living room, staring at the blank television screen, my thoughts louder than any program could ever be. The choice was no longer something I could push aside. The spiral of doubt and pain had left me raw, stripped of any illusions. I couldn't live like this anymore, trapped between what we used to be and the truth of what we had become. The weight of the betrayal wasn't just on her shoulders. It was on mine now, too. My silence had made me complicit in the charade we were living. I stood, my legs feeling heavier than they should as I walked into the kitchen. She was slicing fruit, her back to me, her hair tied up in a way that exposed the curve of her neck, a sight that once filled me with tenderness. Now it only deepened the ache. She turned when she heard me enter, smiling brightly, her voice light as she asked if I wanted coffee. I shook my head, my voice barely above a whisper as I told her we needed to talk. The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Her smile faltered, her hands stilling over the cutting board. She turned to face me fully, her expression shifting to one of cautious concern. I couldn't delay it any longer. I told her I knew about Mark, about the messages, the photos, the lies. My voice was steadier than I expected, each word measured and deliberate. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, her expression was unreadable, a mix of shock, fear, and something else I couldn't place. She tried to deny it at first, her voice trembling as she insisted it wasn't what it seemed. But I wouldn't let her evade the truth. I pressed, my anger surfacing in sharp bursts, demanding honesty. Her defenses crumbled quickly, her shoulders sagging as she admitted what I already knew. Yes, there was someone else. Yes, it had been going on for months. Yes, she had lied to me, to us. Her voice cracked as she spoke, tears welling in her eyes. She begged for forgiveness, swearing it had been a mistake, a lapse in judgment. She told me she still loved me, that I was the one she wanted to be with, that she would do whatever it took to fix what she had broken. But her words felt hollow, echoes of promises that had already been broken. I stood there, numb, her apologies washing over me without sinking in. My mind raced, flashing through memories of our life together, the love we had shared, the trust that had once seemed unshakable. How had it come to this? How had we let everything we'd built slip through our fingers? When she reached for me, I stepped back, the distance between us feeling like a chasm. I told her I needed time, space to think, to figure out what came next. Her tears fell freely now, her voice desperate as she begged me to stay, to let her prove that she could make things right. I left the house without another word, the cool morning air hitting me like a jolt as I stepped outside. The streets were quiet, the world seemingly unaware of the turmoil inside me. I walked aimlessly, the sound of my footsteps on the pavement grounding me as I tried to make sense of the chaos. The choice felt impossible. Could I forgive her? Could I rebuild the trust that had been shattered so completely? Or was this the end of us? The final chapter in a story I had once thought would last forever? The questions circled endlessly, each one heavier than the last. By the time I returned home, the sun was high in the sky, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold knot in my chest. She was sitting on the couch, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red from crying. She looked up when I entered, hope flickering in her expression. I didn't have the heart to meet her gaze. I told her I wasn't ready to talk, that I needed time to process everything. She nodded silently, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. The tension in the room was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken words. I retreated to the bedroom, closing the door behind me, the weight of the decision pressing down on me like a physical force. The choice was mine to make, but I still didn't know what it would be. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same, no matter what I decided. Our life, our love, had been irrevocably changed. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if we could survive it. The silence between us stretched for days, unbroken, but heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. She tiptoed around the house, her presence tentative and subdued, as if she were a guest in her own home. I spent most of my time alone, retreating to the bedroom or the porch, searching for answers in the stillness. The nights were the hardest. Lying awake in the dark, I replayed our conversation over and over, dissecting every word, every tear, every plea. Her confession had answered some questions, but left others hanging like unfinished sentences. Was it guilt that drove her apologies, or fear of losing the life we had built? Could love survive betrayal this deep, or was it already lost, buried beneath the rubble of her lies? On the fourth night, I couldn't bear the limbo any longer. I found her in the living room, sitting on the couch with her knees pulled to her chest. She looked up as I entered, her eyes swollen from crying, but full of something I hadn't seen before, resignation. I sat down across from her, the space between us feeling both vast and suffocating. I told her I had made a decision. My voice was steady, though every word felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 bricks. I didn't look at her as I spoke, afraid that meeting her eyes would unravel me completely. I explained that I couldn't ignore what had happened, couldn't pretend it hadn't shattered something fundamental between us. Trust was the foundation of everything we had built together, and without it, I didn't know how to move forward. Her betrayal wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice, one that had rewritten the rules of our relationship without my consent. Her sobs broke the quiet as I spoke, her body shaking with the force of them. She begged me to reconsider, to let her prove that she could rebuild what she had destroyed. Her voice was raw, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush, but I held firm. I told her it wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about survival. I needed to step away, to find myself again outside of the shadow of her actions. The next morning, I packed a bag. She watched me from the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her face pale and tear-streaked. I didn't say much as I zipped the suitcase closed. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said. I told her I'd be staying with a friend for a while, giving us both the space to think, to breathe. Leaving the house felt like walking away from a part of myself. Every corner, every piece of furniture, every photograph on the wall carried the weight of our shared history. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief. The life we had built was over, but in its place, there was a chance for something new, something untainted by lies. In the weeks that followed, I found moments of clarity in the solitude. The anger ebbed, replaced by a quiet sadness that was easier to carry. I spent time with friends, reconnected with family, and slowly began to rebuild the pieces of myself that had been lost in the chaos. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable. But each step forward, no matter how small, was a victory. She reached out to me often in those first weeks, her messages filled with regret and promises of change. I read them, but didn't respond. I needed to heal on my own, to figure out who I was outside of us. For so long, my identity had been tied to our life together, and now I had to learn how to stand on my own. Eventually, the messages grew less frequent, the calls stopped. The silence was bittersweet, a reminder of what we had lost, but also a sign that we were both moving forward. I didn't know if we'd ever find our way back to each other, and for the first time, I was okay with that. The future felt uncertain, but it also felt like mine again. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I realized that the pain was no longer the defining feature of my days. It was still there, a dull ache that would likely never fully fade, but it no longer consumed me. In its place was a quiet strength, a resilience born from surviving the worst and finding a way to keep going. The choice I had made wasn't easy, but it was necessary. In the end, it wasn't about her or what she had done. It was about me, about reclaiming my life and learning to live again. And as the sky darkened into a canvas of stars, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Thank you for watching the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss interesting life stories, and write a comment if you like the story. See you.